Hi everyone, welcome back to Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Today's video is all about really big books. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books. And today's video is all about the very biggest books, both on my TBR and that I have read. And I was tagged to do this by the lovely Gemma from Gemma Books. I also recently watched a big books video on Ben Reads Good, and I just thought the discussion is interesting, and yeah, I thought we'd have a little chat about whether or not I think I like big books. What are the 5 biggest, chunkiest books I have ever read? And do I have 5 big chunky books left to read on the Giant TBR? All this will be answered. Yes, if you've been around for a while, you will know that I am not particularly a big reader of big books. So I have read some big books on my channel, and one saga that was ongoing on my channel for a very long time concerned a big book that I was attempting to read and did read. More on that later. And my confession is that I would much rather read like 5 or 6 small books instead of one really massive chunky book, because I just feel like I am getting to more books, and there are so many books in the world that I want to read that I always feel like I'm getting the most out of my time if I've read small books and lots of them rather than one really big chunky book. And at the moment this thought is in my mind as I'm reading 2 not particularly massive books in the scheme of things and in the scheme of what we're going to talk about today, but some books that feel really big. So I'm reading 2 largish classics. One is Crime and Punishment. Now I feel like Crime and Punishment should have a much larger page count than it does. In my edition, which is the vintage edition and is translated by Richard Pevier and Larissa Volokonsky, there are only 564 pages, but boy are these 564 long pages. So you can see my bookmark is in here. If I show you an example page, there are no paragraph breaks, there are no line breaks really at all in this book, and yeah, it's like this all the way through. The pages are packed from top to bottom with text. And this is an example for me of a book that I feel like is a really massive chunky book because it's taking me a long time. It takes a lot of brain power to read a Russian classic, I have realised. So this is by far and away not one of the biggest Russian classics, but it sure feels like it. So I would say that this is a very hefty 500 pages, well, near enough 600 pages, let's say. I think a lot of editions would have over 600 pages of that. Whereas Jude the Obscure, which I'm reading with a lovely group set up for Misery May by Scott at Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, and Gemma from Gemma Books, I'm reading Jude the Obscure with them. This clocks in at 510 pages, and yes, it feels like a classic, but it feels like a much lighter and shorter classic than Crime and Punishment, for example, which in these editions is only like 50 odd pages longer. This is much more easy to read, and yeah, enjoying this hardy book, but worth a mention as a big-ish book that I have on the go at the moment. So big books are on my mind. I've always thought, and I've actually quite often said, that I don't think there's any reason for a book to be over 600 pages long. And then I always get my friends saying, but Alice, 2 of your favourite books of last year were over 600 pages. They were Cloud Cuckoo Land, which I never stopped going on about, 626 pages, and of course the lovely Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead, an absolutely epic story. And this one, even in its paperback form, which looks deceptively small, is 672 pages long. So yeah, I did love both of these books. This one, as a paperback that looks deceptively small, is quite smallish print and quite concisely put together, whereas Cloud Cuckoo Land definitely has lots and lots of blank space and lots of chapters that are like maybe just one page. So I found this a really easy 600 pages to read. Great Circle I initially actually listened to, and it is over, I think, over 26 hours long. There are of course always going to be favourites and exceptions, so I might revise my statement to I don't think there's any reason for a book to be over 700 pages. Even the books that I've got here that are over 700 pages that I have read, I wonder if they could have been cut down a little bit. Controversial, because a lot of them are actually really, really big classics. So I'm not actually saying that these books should be shorter. I'm just saying that I don't favour reading a really, really long book. Please do, in the comments, drop me the longest books that you have read that you think I would personally really enjoy, that might break my brain into thinking that big books are excellent. And I must say, all of the ones that are included on the pile of biggest books I've read, I have enjoyed. When I sat down to do this, especially with the books to be read, some of the first ones that came up are massive books that are collected works. So one of the biggest books on my shelf that I've shown a few times is the collected works of Oscar Wilde. This clocks in over 1,000 pages, but this is, if not all, then most of Oscar Wilde's work. His poetry, short stories, novels, novellas, plays. So it's going to be a big book. I'm not going to count this in the books I talk about because I didn't really think it was fair to be talking about books that are a massive collection. I would never sit down and read this in one sitting. I don't intend to. I intend to read the works one or two at a time, and it's unlikely that I would ever sit down and finish this cover to cover, so not including it. Even bigger than that, definitely the biggest book that I own, I've not read it all the way through, is the complete works of Shakespeare. It's quite difficult to lift. I've read very little of this. I've read some of Shakespeare's plays. I can't precisely remember how many, but it's not many. So it might be 6 plays, something like that, which is a drop in the ocean of this book. So again, it's not a book I would sit down and read over a period of a couple of months, so I'm not counting that either. Although I have the Oscar Wilde on my giant TBR list, I don't keep this on my giant TBR list because I feel like it's something that would be like a life ongoing project, and I don't know whether I would ever read this entire collected work, so haven't counted those. What have I counted? I also haven't counted my longest ever audiobook, which was 35 hours and 32 minutes, and that was Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. We're going to hear that name come up quite a bit today. I think wherever I looked this up, it told me that Our Mutual Friend is approximately 918 pages, depending of course on what edition you have. Haven't counted this, but it's definitely the longest audiobook I've ever read. If we were going purely on page counts, it would definitely be up there. Caveat on the top 5, I own the top 3 biggest books that I've ever read. Possibly own one of the other ones somewhere, such as in my mum's garage. I don't own the other one. I borrowed it from my mum to read it. I would like to get a copy of this for myself, but I'm a bit muddled as to position 5 and position 4, because when I looked them up on Goodreads, one had far more pages than the other. When I've looked them up on the internet generally, it was the other way round. So I'm not sure. I don't know which edition precisely of these books that I read. We're going to start with a Dickens, and it is David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, which was published in 1849. This, according to Goodreads, the edition that I read was 877 pages long. I definitely read the vintage, so maybe it was 877 pages long. On the internet generally, it has told me might be as much as 1,000 pages, but I don't think it was. But yeah, somewhere between the high 800s and the high 900s, we have David Copperfield, depending on your edition. And this was the fastest I've ever read a massive classic. To be precise, I read it in January 2020 because I wanted to go and see the film that recently came out of David Copperfield. My mum wanted to go and see it in the cinema, and I thought I better read the book first. I wanted to read the book first. I didn't quite manage it, so I think I had about 3 chapters left to read when we went to see the film. But nonetheless, it did spur me on to read this book in under a month. So I read it between the 14th of January and the 1st of February. I love David Copperfield. I think it's a fantastic Dickens. Possibly my favourite, but my favourite Dickens varies from day to day, I would say. Could be Our Mutual Friend as well. Could be Great Expectations, much shorter. But I did love David Copperfield. And of course, I have recently loved its offspring, Demon Copperhead, by Barbara Kingsolver and inspired by David Copperfield, of course. So moving on to number 4, which obviously could, as I've said, could be number 5. This was a book that Goodreads told me clocked in at 939 pages, but the internet told me was more around the 700 and something page mark. This is the book that could be in my mum's garage somewhere. I loved this book. So this was Blonde by Joyce Carol Oates. It's the newest book on the list by about 150 years, and this is a sort of biographical fiction about Marilyn Monroe, and I absolutely flew through this. This book predates when I was keeping a book journal, so it doesn't predate keeping lists of what books I was reading, but it does predate a fuller book journal, so I don't actually know much information. I don't think I even have like a rating or anything, but I do remember loving it, getting through it really, really fast for a big book. I found Joyce Carol Oates' version of Marilyn Monroe's life so fascinating, and I believe this has very recently been made into a film, which I would be interested to see. I read this between July and August of 2002. It was published, I believe, originally in the year 2000. This is a long book that I did really, really love. Next up, we have the 3 books that are definitely 100% without question the biggest books that I have ever read. When I started BookTube, this was the biggest book that I had ever read, and it is Bleak House by Charles Dickens. This was the first really chunky classic that I decided to read of my own accord, and I read this a long time ago. I read this in 2015 when I was teaching, so it did take me a very long time, because reading something as big as this alongside teaching is definitely a long-term project, and it was a book that I certainly had on the go while reading other books. So this I read between the 16th of February 2015 and the 24th of January 2016. So this took me nearly a year to read all of Charles Dickens' Bleak House. As I say, I had a very busy life going on at the same time. This is 941 pages and it was published in 1852. Although this is the Dickens book that kind of is quite crime related, which is why I read it first. It's about a big court case, Jarndyce versus Jarndyce. It has one of the first detectives in literature, which was Detective Inspector Bucket. I did really enjoy this, but there was definitely stuff that was probably too legal and involved for me in this. I have never stated that this is my favourite Dickens. Maybe if I went back and read it at a later point it might be, but I'm not sure I'm going to commit to nearly 1,000 pages of rereading. Bleak House took me nearly a year, and that's going to be even more relevant to this next book, because if you've been around on my channel for a while you will know that it took me the longest it's ever taken me to read a book to read this book. And I had this on the go, not to say I was actively reading it at all times, and certainly most of the time it was not my only book. This one took me 1 year and 1 month, and I feel like I must hold the record for how long it's taken someone on BookTube to read a book. If you look back over my old videos, you can follow the journey of me trying to read this book. I started it in June of 2021, which was like the second month that I was on BookTube, and I saw Ancients-a-thon, and I wanted to read something that was written pre-1700, I think the cut-off might have been, and I'd had this on my shelf for a long time. I made a video about this being the most intimidating book on my bookshelf, and at the time it certainly was, and that was clocking in at 1022 pages, Don Quixote by Cervantes. I don't think I've ever been prouder of myself for finishing a book than I was when I finally finished Don Quixote in June, late June of 2022. I just felt such a sense of achievement that I had read such a ridiculously big book that had taken me such a long time, and I felt held to reading this by the fact that I'd held myself accountable on my channel, and I'm really glad I did, because ever since there have been mentions of Don Quixote in books, and every time I see those it makes me smile, because I now know exactly what it's referring to. I know all about this crazy Don Quixote who thinks he is a knight errant and has the great sidekick Sancho Panza. Don't be put off by this having taken me a year, because actually it's very, very readable and it's very, very episodic, so you can dip in and out, which partly contributed to it taking me such a long time, because I kept putting it down and picking it back up again. It's not a book that is particularly hurt or impacted by putting down and picking up again later, so yeah. The second biggest book I have ever read is Don Quixote. It was a lot of fun talking about it for on and off for a year on BookTube. And this was published in 1605. It's considered like the first novel, and it also is one of the best-selling books of all time. But Don Quixote did not stay at the top very long, because in August of 2022 I decided to take on another really big book, and this is now the biggest book I have ever read, without question. I started this book with the lovely Gemma from Gemma Books and Fraser from Fraser Simon's Springboard Thought. This massive mammoth is 1276 pages. I haven't read any really big books since, because this didn't take anywhere near as long though. I did have fears that it was going to be another year-long one, but this actually took me, I started it on the 1st of August last year, and I finished it on the 23rd of October, like about 3 months. And that's The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. I think that this will reign as my longest book ever for a very, very long time, because I can't see myself picking up a book of over 1276 pages. I quite frequently see a book that is that long and think, I will never read that. So if there is a book that you think would prove me wrong, and you think I should invest my time in reading that is over 1276 pages long, I would love to hear it in the comments. Let me know. But for now, let me tell you the 5 biggest books that now remain on my giant TBR, and they are nowhere near as big. One of these is a classic and one of them is a modern classic, and I anticipate those two taking me much longer than probably the others, which are much lighter. Weirdly, there are 3 thrillers in this list, and I didn't think that I owned any thrillers that were this massive, but apparently I do. So clocking in at only 669 pages, I have The Lost Symbol by Dan Brown. This is the 3rd in the Robert Langdon series. Despite what everyone may say about Dan Brown, I really did enjoy the previous 2 in this series, which were Angels and Demons and The Da Vinci Code, which Dan Brown is probably most famous for. I have read a lot of his other thrillers. I think this one I technically bought for my husband, and I think he actually stopped reading this before the end and said he didn't need to read the last chapter or something, which blew my mind. But yeah, one day I will read this and then probably get on to the rest of the Robert Langdon series. A bit bigger than that is Nemesis by Jo Nesbø. I have never read Jo Nesbø, and this is part of Jo Nesbø's famous detective Harry Hole series. But I don't think that this is the right place in the series to start, so I'm not sure if this is maybe the 4th book in the series, and I feel a bit like I ought to read the first one first. Let me know if you've read this series. Would it be fine to read it out of order? I think I picked this up because it was in the 3 for 2 at Waterstones when that used to be a thing, and I thought it sounded good. So that's 706 pages, and it is a detective one. Next up we have the modern classic, clocking in at 720 pages, which is actually shorter than I thought it was because it looks quite big. It is The Bonfire of the Vanities by Tom Wolfe. My favourite quote on this book is that it is a day-glow Dickens. Makes me really want to read it. This is set in New York, I believe, maybe set in the sort of world of the stock market and people with lots of money. It's about Sherman McCoy, who is a bond trader and a self-appointed master of the universe. He has a fashionable wife, a Park Avenue apartment and a southern mistress. His spectacular fall begins the moment he's involved in a hit-and-run accident in the Bronx. That's all I need to know. I think this was another book I picked up because it's sort of crime fiction adjacent, and it was written in the 80s, I believe, so looking forward to that one. Now this one is definitely the biggest out of all of my crime and thriller books, and it's from a historical crime fiction series by C.J. Sansom. Now I'm nowhere near ready to read this one because this is the 5th novel in the Matthew Shardlake series. I've read book 1 and book 3 because I started with book 3 for some reason. Believe it or not, this is not the biggest book in this series. There is one called Tombland, which every time I see it in charity shops, I think, I'm glad I haven't got that far with the series yet, because that one must be nearing 1,000 pages. It's huge. Stone is a mere 730 pages, and I'm sure that this will actually be a quicker read than, say, a 730 page classic, because these are really, really interesting, sort of murder mystery, but set in Henry VIII's time. I do really enjoy this series. I must get back to it, and this is a very big book on my TBR. Now the biggest book on my TBR, the only one that would have qualified as a mammoth this year for March of the Mammoths, I believe, is 878 pages long, and it's Dombey and Son, back to Dickens, so I hope this will be the next Dickens that I read. The only other one on my shelf is Oliver Twist, and that's much, much shorter than this, but I would like to read Dombey and Son next. I actually did start it in Victober, but I think I only read 2 chapters because I had only just finished The Count of Monte Cristo, and I just didn't have brain space for another big book. When I do get back to Dickens, this will be what I read. I'm really looking forward to it because I think this is supposed to be a really good one. I do love reading a bit of Dickens, as you've seen from this list. Those are my very big books. The ones I have to read and the ones I have already read. If you would like to share the biggest books you've read, please do so in the comments down below. I would love to chat to you. Have you read any of these books? What do you think of big books? Are you a big book reader, or do you prefer a short book? I'm aware of the presence on this list of no fantasy whatsoever, because I'm not a fantasy reader. Another book that's very much on my mind and my mental TBR at the moment is Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch, which I know is a big book, but I would love for you to give me your big book recommendations in the comments down below. I'm going to tag a couple of people if they want to tell us about their biggest books. If you also want to join in and talk about the biggest books in your life, consider yourself tagged. I am also going to tag Emily from Novelle Novels. I think I would like to know what are the biggest books on that even more massive bookshelf of hers, and I would love to hear from Jennifer Loves Books. What are the biggest books that you've read, Jennifer? So can I overcome my aversion to big books in the future? Well, possibly. I mean, my favourite book of the year so far has been Demon Copperhead. My favourite book of last year, Cloud Cuckoo Land. So am I perhaps getting better at reading bigger books? We will see. I think after Crime and Punishment, I might need a little break from big books, even though it is deceptively not that big. Anyway, if you have enjoyed this rambly video about big books and my relationship with them today, please do give it a like. Please do consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I will hope to see you all again very soon for another video all about books here on Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now.